Welcome back to another episode of the Recharge Zone podcast. I'm your host, Ann-Margaret Gonzalez, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brent Doty, as well as Kristy Kollaus, EAA Environmental Scientist for the Edwards Aquifer Habitat Conservation Plan, also known as the EAHCP.
In this episode, Kristy is going to go over some of the Edwards Aquifer creatures that live in the depths of the underworld, that is the Edwards Aquifer.
Hi, Brent and Ann-Margaret. Nice to be here today with you.
Glad to have you, Kristy. So can you tell us a little bit about your role at the EAA as an environmental scientist?
Yes. Just to give you a little bit of background, I have my undergrad and graduate degree in aquatic biology at Texas State. And once I completed my master's there, I worked at Texas State for several years. And I got to work on the Edwards Aquifer Conservation Plan when it first started. And so I brought that knowledge over to the EAA when I moved here in 2018. And now as the environmental scientist, I help with our water quality program, as well as to oversee our biological monitoring program and our refugio program as part of the EAHCP.
Oh, thanks, Kristy. As y'all recall, a couple episodes ago, we interviewed Javier and Jenny about a program called the Aquifer Storage and Recovery, or otherwise known as the ASR. Well, that has a little bit to do with our talk today because the ASR is one of the spring flow protection measures. Folks lease water and store water in the ASR to be used during times of drought, so we're not pumping directly from the Edwards in a repeat of the drought of record scenario. So it's beneficial because it provides additional spring flow to our two spring systems that house several federally endangered species and is a very sensitive habitat. Can you tell us a little more about that, Kristy?
Yes, Brent. It's very important for us to maintain our spring flows during low flow periods as to maintain sufficient habitat for those aquifer dwelling species since they can't actively move. And then it's also important to maintain a sufficient amount of water flowing out of the springs for our San Marcos and Comal systems, since it supports the habitat for our threatened and endangered species. So that includes our water quality, so maintaining certain amounts of dissolved oxygen, as well as water temperature, and maintaining certain parts of the habitat, such as aquatic vegetation for the found darter, as well as just habitat for one of our endangered species, the Texas wild rice, one of our one and only plant species.
Now, you've all these different species that we find in the springs, and that is one of the things that I find so interesting about the Edwards Aquifer, is that it has these species that you find literally nowhere else on Earth. And I've even heard, maybe they're tall tales, you tell me, about a certain species that lives deep in the depths of the aquifer and that we kind of only know about because it occasionally gets sucked up through artesian wells and brought to the surface. Am I just making this up? Is this a myth or is this a real thing, Kristy?
No, Brent, you are correct. You know, I find that often people think that because the aquifer is dark and lightless that it doesn't have a lot of life. However, that's the complete opposite. It's full of life with a variety of species. And one of those that you're talking about, we find pretty far down in the depths of the aquifer, around 900 to 1,500 feet. So within the dark depths or the underworld. And it's one of the top predators. And it's known as the wide-mouthed catfish. And ironically, its scientific name is Satan urostomus. What's interesting, a couple of interesting facts about this the blind cat. Obviously, it's called a blind cat, and it's eyeless. It's also white or opaque, or we may say ghost-like in color. If you're wondering how it may detect its prey, since it doesn't have eyes, well, it has similar to other fish, it has a lateral line or a sensory system, and this sensory system allows fish to detect movement within the water. The wide-mouthed catfish has this lateral line that extends onto its head, and it allows the catfish to navigate its environment as well as find prey which has been known to be crustaceans and other invertebrates.
Wow, that's so fascinating. So what is the listing for this? I'm curious. Is a part of the EAHCP or no, not yet?
Well, Ann-Margaret, it's up for petition this year. So they're going to be, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is doing an evaluation or a species status assessment. And so after they collect information about the species status, then they will rule whether or not it should be listed as threatened, endangered, or if it will not be listed at all.
Oh, okay, I see.
So, Kristy, that's just amazing to confirm. What I've heard in the past is that there are creatures way deep down in the aquifer like that. Are there other predators that live in the aquifer and are also blind because it's in complete darkness? What else is out there?
Well, Brent, if we move up into the shallower parts of the aquifer, we find one of our most charismatic species of the Edwards Aquifer, the Texas blind salamander. And that is, it's known as a top predator as well. And like you already mentioned, it lacks size. And it also, it's a salamander, and similar to other aquatic salamanders, it has external gills that help the salamander breathe or obtain oxygen through the water. Similar to the wide-mouthed catfish, it lacks pigment and is white and translucent. Sometimes if you run a light onto it, it is actually shimmery in color, so it looks very ghostly.
Wow, Kristy, that's really interesting about the Texas blind salamander. Is it one of the listed species in the EAHCP?
Yes, it is one of our covered species, and it's currently listed as endangered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
And there are some other neat little factoids about it, right?
There is an interesting or cool fact that was recently discovered by our staff in our EAHCP Refugia program, is that the Texas blind salamanders has the ability to regenerate limbs. And how did they find this information out? Well, as they were going out to collect individuals for our Refugia program, they found a specimen or an individual they collected that had a part of a limb missing from an injury that occurred in the wild. Ironically enough, going with the Halloween theme, this individual was collected on a Friday the 13th, so they termed it Freddy after Freddy Krueger. So once they had this individual with the injured limb or the missing limb, they consulted an expert on species limb regeneration, and this individual suggested that they perform surgery to have a clean cut where that injury had tried to heal but didn't potentially regenerate. So they actually performed surgery with the individual or Freddy under anesthesia to make that clean cut. After the surgery, the Refugia staff monitored the limb, and Freddy was able to grow a fully functional limb within 91 days. So they actually have video of Freddy moving and using its limb after 91 days after the incision.
Well, that's fascinating, Kristy. And so Freddy lives at the Refugia, right? And can you explain to us a little bit about what the Refugia actually is?
Absolutely. Since our EAA-HCP covered species are found in a limited range, and they also are considered threatened or endangered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we have a Refugia facility. And what a Refugia is, it's an off-site facility from the river where we maintain a subset of the wild individuals to have, in case of a catastrophic event, be it human or natural, that removes the remaining species within the system. The Refugia program then allows for us to reintroduce these species within the environment.
So, Kristy, let me get this straight. We have a blind salamander with medusa-like gills that can also regenerate limbs and is being housed in a facility called the Refugia as kind of a backup supply of these species. That is crazy.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, there are actually other predators even smaller than the salamander, but also in the aquifer, right?
That's correct, Brent. One of our other EAHCP covered species, the Pex cave amphipod, which is only a few millimeters in total length, has been shown to be a predator as well. It's a small crustacean, so it's closely, if you think, similar to a crab. And they have been shown to consume smaller invertebrates, and also within our Refugia program, if they are within the same container, their own young. However, the Refugia staff are now designing and developing tanks that will hold different types of food for the adults, as well as for providing hiding places for the young.
Oh, to hopefully like mitigate the chances of them eating their youth, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
So we're giving them different options. Basically, it sounds like they're opportunistic feeders. So whatever is in front of them, they're going to eat. So we want to give those young a chance to grow up.
Wow, so we've got a blind catfish, blind salamander, these Peck's Cave amphipods, such a variety of different life in the aquifer. But I know also that we have species that don't really belong here, but sometimes show up in our rivers in this area. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. One of the introduced species that is of particular concern for the EHCP is the armored suckermouth catfish. It's thought that the species was originally introduced in the 1990s, and it's most likely from aquarium dumping. So once an individual outgrows a tank, someone is partial to their fish, and so instead of potentially flushing it, they dump it within the river, not knowing the effects that it may have on the natural system.
And how big can they get when they're dumped in the river?
Well, Ann-Margaret, right now we know of 2 different species of suckermouth catfish, and one of the species, Pterochlyptes, can actually grow up to over 2 pounds in size and close to 2 feet in length.
Wow.
So these invasive species, they compete for habitat with our native species. They cause water quality concerns. What are the other problems with them, and what's being done to help stop them?
You're right, Brent. Using their sucker mouth and armored bodies, they like to burrow themselves into the riverbanks, so that increases the turbidity or murkiness in the water within our naturally clear systems. And they also can cause erosion to our riverbanks, which can be a concern. Also, with their sucker-like mouth, they're algae eaters. So they go along the river bottom foraging, and in doing so, they can potentially disturb habitat for one of our other EAHCP covered species, the small fountain darter. Now, how are we trying to reduce or remove the effects of the suckermouth catfish? We have a conservation measure in place with a contractor that goes around and tries to remove the suckermouth. And the best way that they've seen to remove the individuals is through spearfishing, which is pretty interesting.
That is fascinating. So what can you explain to us a little bit about how they do that and how they go about it? I mean, I guess I'm curious to see how many they've also collected.
Sure. So the contractor will go out up to twice a month, and he'll swim through the river, and where he finds the suckermouth, he'll try to spear it, and he'll also retain the individual, and he collects measurements and weights so that we can track the sizes of the individuals we capture. The contractor has also developed a spearfishing or pole spear tournament that occurs within the spring and the fall. And this gives the general public the opportunity to participate in removing this invasive species. To date, the conservation effort within the San Marcos River with Atlas Environmental, the contractor, has been able to remove close to 9,000 suckermouth catfish, totaling close to 5,000 pounds.
Holy cow, 5,000 pounds of invasive catfish removed from the springs. That is impressive.
That's a lot. And so do people eat it, or where does it go? What do they do with them?
Well, so as part of the tournament, Atlas Environmental has put on fish fries with some of the captured or speared individuals. And he has tried to do the suckermouth or the armored catfish. I've heard they're a little bit chewy, so maybe more a gumbo type species. I've also heard that he donates it and it becomes fertilizer.
Oh, that's a great alternative and eco-friendly, right?
That's correct.
Wow, Kristy, well, thank you so much for sharing all about these fascinating creatures in the aquifer and also some that don't belong in our system and everything that y'all are doing to help protect these guys and get rid of the invasives and make our springs and spring creatures more sustainable. So I really appreciate your time today.
Absolutely. And we couldn't do it without our partners and all of our contractors involved in the Edwards Aquifer Habitat Conservation Plan.
All right, y'all. Well, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Recharge Zone podcast. Have questions, ideas for topics, or things you would like to share with us? Well, reach out to us by emailing us at therechargezone@edwardsaquifer.org.